Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today because I had a crazy idea several weeks ago. I saw people throwing around the expression before I started my review of the new Canon 85mm f1.4 LIS. Some people saying this is an Otus with autofocus. And when I saw comments like that, even before I'd actually spent time with this lens, I said, there is somebody that's never used an Otus lens before. And so I thought I would, just for the fun of it, on a whim, I reached out to the people at Zeiss Canada, and they were kind enough to accommodate me and send me an Otus 85mm f1.4 to compare with the new Canon 85mm f1.4 LIS. Now, the Otus series, of course, was birthed several years ago when Zeiss basically gave their engineers free rein to create as close to optical perfection as what is currently possible, without any of the typical restraints. These lenses are much larger than any predecessors, and of course, since that point, there have been imitators that have come along that are equally large. The Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art, for example, is physically large as this and only a hair lighter because it uses less metal in construction compared to the Zeiss. And so they created large lenses. They're incredibly expensive. I mean, the cheapest in the Otus series is around $4,000, and it tops out at $5,000. with this lens right in the middle at around $4,500. So you can almost buy 3 of these new Canon lenses for the price of the Otus. So these are extreme instruments, but they're extreme in the sense that they have basically tried to correct for almost all of the typical lens defects, aberrations that are present in, mere mortal lenses. And so today we're going to jump in and we're going to look at a comparison to see not only how this lens holds up in comparison to that, but I also want to emphasize that sometimes the optically perfect lens isn't necessarily the best lens for you. So let's jump in and let's take a look. Now, those of you that have been following along in this comparison series, you pretty much kind of know what you're going to get here, and that in the center of the frame, all settings being equal, the Otus definitely shows improved contrast and micro contrast, and some of that chromatic aberration, the longitudinal chromatic aberration, just provides a little bit of a contrast robbing haze there with the Canon lens, which of course is not present on the Otus. And if we go out towards the side, I have determined that I think there is a mild centering issue in the copy of the Canon that I have, which is it's stronger on the right side than on the left side. So here on the left side, obviously it looks pretty weak at f1.4. If we pop over to the right side, the Otus is obviously still stronger, but it's a little bit closer here. But as you can see, the Otus is definitely the sharper instrument. Anywhere that you look across the frame, it's just got better contrast and a little bit more detail that's rendered in all of these comparisons. Looking at the image globally, it seems to me that they have roughly equal amounts of vignette here. They both definitely have some vignette at f1.4. Now we'll look at them at f2. So at f2, you can see that vignette has cleared up significantly on them both, perhaps a hair more on the Otus than on the Canon lens, but not by a big margin. So looking here at the center of the frame, once again, the situation is still the same. Contrast and sharpness have improved some on the Canon, but I would say that they have improved more so on the Otus, and still so the Otus is still delivering a more perfect image, better micro contrast. It's just got less of that kind of haze. You can see just the slightest bit of the purple fringing that's there, that veiling effect that takes place from that chromatic aberration. Over towards the side, let's look down here for somewhere different, and you can just see that the Otus, definitely, look at this, for example, the difference between this dark area and this bright area. You can see that there's a difference in that micro contrast, which of course, that is something that Zeiss is famous for. I mean, this is Zeiss at their very best, and as you can see, they do amazing work. Now, stopping both lenses down to f2.8 gives us both images are basically free of any kind of vignette at this point. In terms of the light transmission, it seems to me to be roughly equal. It's thrown off just a little bit by the fact that the Zeiss has so much more micro contrast. And so there's just more punch to the Zeiss image, but they seem to be exposed roughly equally. Biggest difference is this difference in the micro contrast. You can just see in little spots like this, there's just more variation between the dark and the bright area on the Zeiss lens. And so what happens is in all of this texture information, you can just see so much more of it resolved on the Otus lens. And that's, you know, that is the real strength for those that are demanding. They want the absolute best. Even look at the difference in the black levels here compared to here, you know, and compared to a bright area around them. There's just there's a little bit more pop that's taking place there with the Otus lens. So one final look at f4 to see if, you know, maybe the Canon does catch up at a smaller aperture. So we can see exposure looks, you know, pretty close to being the same. What we can see is that, you know, still in that basic micro contrast, you know, it's not surprising. I mean, the Otus is a $4,500 lens. It is, you know, it's the best, and here you can see why. It's just that extra bit of micro contrast, it's that extra bit of resolution. It's just a pretty stunning performance. So what we have now is a series of real-world comparisons where we can bring the autofocus rendering, the bokeh into play here as well, and just look at some real-world factors as a part of this. So as you can see, I shot this comparison during a snowstorm, so I braved the elements for you. I hope you appreciate it. But what we can see here is obviously the Canon suffers from some longitudinal chromatic aberration that the Zeiss does not. And so what Zeiss has done with the Otus lens is deliver as pretty much as close as you're going to get to perfect correction of all aberrations. And so here you can just see completely neutral performance after the plane of focus, whereas we have, you know, green fringing here. And then before the plane of focus, where we have purple fringing here, you're going to see just a completely neutral rendering from the Otus lens. And so you can see a little of that purple fringing here. Whereas if you look here, there's none of that. And so what happens is, for example, let me line up this snow here. And so we've got, you know, we've got an equal amount of exposure and setup here. But what happens here is this is actually due to that difference in contrast, to where the whites look whiter here, and, you know, it's just a little bit more of a veiled look. Whereas with the Otus lens, you've got micro contrast. If people want to know what Zeiss micro contrast is, this is it right here. And so you can see what I'm talking about there. Now, you know, to be fair, this is not, in my opinion, this is not all Otus win. I do think that if we compare some of this defocused area, that it's a little bit softer on the Canon. For example, down here, I just see a little less edging on the Canon example, which is a little bit softer looking to me. Looking at the images globally, you know, maybe even down in this area, it's a little less busy on the Canon than it is on the Otus. Okay, now for a different example, we have got, I'm wanting to look at before and after the plane of focus. So if we look at this area right here, once again, it's the contrast and area around here, the kind of rust patterns. You can just see more resolution and detail from the Otus due to the fact that it has more micro contrast. Here you can see that this edge, which is, you know, very clean on the Otus, it's a little bit damaged by the green fringing there, and you can even see a little of that green fringing around this, where it's, of course, it's very neutral on the Otus result. Now, I did find this interesting here, and this is where I see both a win for Canon and a loss for Canon. Obviously here we're seeing that longitudinal chromatic aberration. We'll call it Bokeh from here. It's, you know, pink, purple before plane of focus, it's green afterward. Before the plane of focus on the Zeiss, you know, it's neutral. After the plane of focus, it's neutral. However, once again, I do see in my eye a little bit more busyness in the texture. And so this is the challenge with when you have a lens that has tons of micro contrast, in that it's hard to just apply that contrast to, you know, your plane of focus. And while Zeiss has done a magnificent job here, I see a little bit more softness in this rendering before and right after the plane of focus from the Canon lens than I do from the Zeiss lens. And if we move, you know, on down a ways, once again, it's still a little bit true in that the lack of contrast here means that this stands out a little bit less And so you can see it even at a global level to where this shows up a little bit less on the Canon lens than it does on the Zeiss lens. Now here's another similar comparison, but I wanted to include some little bit further defocus region in the image here. And so you can look at kind of a global rendering where we've got several different stages of defocus as a part of it. And of course the area over here is a little bit busy. Now, if we look along, our plane of focus, we see a now expected result. You can see that there's more micro contrast in the Zeiss result as expected. And of course, the lack of any kind of chromatic aberrations, it changes the outcome of this. And so we can see that here. Now, if we look at this defocused area, once again, I see, again, it's very minor. Zeiss has done an amazing job with the Otus series. I mean, in giving you both amazing resolution and contrast while also giving you soft defocus regions. However, I do think that the Canon is maybe a hair softer on some of this than what Zeiss is. And the only thing I see marring here is just the tiniest bit of that green fringing that's there that's not present on the neutral performance from the Zeiss. Here's another real world example here. And so, as we're kind of now accustomed to seeing, there's more detail that's there on the Zeiss version at f1.4, and you can see how the fringing plays a role in that. Neutral on the Zeiss, the green fringing on the Canon. There's some other interesting things here, as you can see as you move beyond that plane of focus. The green fringing does a little bit of marring here, but as we go to the autofocus area here, and it's some ways it's easier to look at it globally. I mean, there's certainly, you couldn't really argue that the Zeiss renders it better than what the Canon does. And if anything, the Canon gives you a little bit more softness. That's the trade-off. And so we're going to talk about that in our wrap-up. Now, as you can maybe imagine, this particular scene right here is going to put the Canon in worst case scenario. A very high contrast scene. And so high contrast, of course, is murder if you've got issues with, the longitudinal aberrations. And so as you can see here, a real loss of contrast in this situation, and thus a loss of resolution compared to the Otus, which looks fantastic in this situation. I mean, this is an absolute torture test, and this is the superiority of a lens, that costs so much right here. And so you can see, in this case, you're going to favor the Zeiss Bokeh every time because the Canon's is spoiled by, all of the aberrations. And this test is major enough that I was able to get a tiny bit of fringing out of the Zeiss. I don't even hardly remember ever doing that before, but you can see the vast difference, however, with the Canon result in the fringing that's taking place there. And so, this unfortunately is where the Canon is really going to struggle. And so just, know that kind of scene is not going to put the Canon at its best. Now we're going to return indoors for the shot here, and since we have been using this in previous comparisons, I'm going to return to it. Number one, I do want to say that both have produced a very rich looking result here in my eye. The Zeiss result is more contrasty. If you look at this, the difference in the darkness, it's darker on the Zeiss, and you'll find similarly that the brighter areas are, every bit as bright, if not brighter, on the Zeiss. So there's a win here for both lenses, and I'm going to show you what that is. Obviously, the Zeiss wins for the complete neutrality, lack of chromatic aberration in the situation. It is so beautifully corrected for this kind of scenario that it allows you some great latitude. And so as a result, you can just see there's more texture, pop, and information there. Now, what you can also see, however, is that the Zeiss does suffer from some onion bokeh quality, and that is something that I had kind of forgotten that it was there. And I remember seeing it on the Otus 85mm. I don't remember it on the Otus 85. And so actually this is an area where the Milvus is far more neutral than the Otus is in this. But the Zeiss does, in this kind of situation, it does suffer from some onion bokeh. And so if that's something that just absolutely drives you crazy, and you shoot a lot of times with bright highlights in your shots, here you can take consolation that if you can't afford the Otus, you can tell your friends, well, I don't have it because it has onion bokeh. Now, if we look at this second image here, more from the perspective of the CA situation, you're going to see that in this situation, of course, the Otus is going to look better, you know, in the actual area of resolution, you know, more contrast, no, you know, apparent CA in this situation. And so as a result, I mean, that portion of the image is certainly more pleasing. And as you start to move towards the defocused area, you know, you're getting an extremely neutral result from the Zeiss, whereas you're getting some of the grain fringing. This also shows, however, that the Canon does a better job of retaining a more circular shape towards the edge. And I also note that the autofocus bokeh circles here are actually a little bit bigger on the Canon and softer looking, and of course less busy due to not having that onion bokeh effect. So there's no question in terms of circular highlights that I would choose those from the Canon over the Otus. And then there's one final comparison. So in this last comparison, we're going back out to, you know, the brick wall type situation. And so looking here, I've purposely not included the information from both lenses. And so I want you to guess which one is the Canon and which one is the Zeiss. And so as you can see, it's pretty clear to me that this particular comparison favors the lens on the left, and you can see that it looks sharper just in the texture information that's rendered. You know, here's a little bit of, you know, seeming veiling on this side, whereas we've got great contrast here. Now, let me just toggle back on the information and show you that, yes, on the right, it's not the Canon, it's actually the Otus. Now, the one difference here is this is a handheld comparison, and it's at very mild situations. It's f4, and it's 1/200th of a second. And it's on a 5D Mark IV, which is certainly not the highest resolution body out there at 30 megapixels. But what this shows you that even at moderate shutter speeds, there is just enough movement to create a little bit of motion blur on the Otus that robs resolution shooting handheld compared to the Canon that has more apparent resolution because it has an image stabilizer. And so you can insert on the right side any of the competitors. You can put the Sigma 85 Art, you can put the Zeiss Milvus 85mm, you can put the Samyang Rokinon XP 1.2 lens here on the side, and you're going to get the same kind of result because of the image stabilizer on the Canon. So the importance of that image stabilizer, even at moderately high shutter speeds, this is a very common shutter speed, for example, shooting at a wedding venue or something like that. Byproduct is that the apparently sharper lens is the Canon, and that comes down to these two letters right here, IS. Now, those of you that have been following along in this series, you're not surprised by the fact that the Otus has less chromatic aberration, that it has better contrast and micro contrast, and you're not surprised by the fact that it shows, you know, more resolution at the end of the day. And so I think that you expected that outcome. But I want to just make a few comments here at the end to kind of put everything into perspective. Number one, in that last test, we saw that it doesn't matter how highly resolving, how optically perfect this lens is. The reality is that in real-world shooting, where you're shooting handheld on the fly, it's simply not going to be practical for a lot of shooters. The Otus series was really created for, in my mind, commercial photographers or those that were in situations where they basically needed, you know, optical perfection. And perhaps even for those that, you know, just like to own the very best. But for everyday use, most modern camera bodies are really, they're not very well suited for shooting manual focus glass like this. And, you know, and so beyond that, right now, I actually think that the best platform for manual focus glass is really the Sony A7R series that gives you an amazing sensor to pair with some of the amazing optics that are available. But it also gives you all the manual focus aids that help to make sure that the image is going to actually be in focus. And I think that that's kind of best case scenario for getting the most out of your Zeiss glass or, you know, equivalent type lenses. But beyond that, most other DSLRs they're not very well equipped for helping you with achieving manual focus accurately. And of course, Many people are really not all that good at manually focusing. Beyond that, we saw that the addition of the image stabilizer means that the most amazing optics in the world aren't necessarily going to give you the best results when you're shooting handheld, when you're shooting in moving situations like, shooting a wedding, shooting portraits, shooting events. And so in a very practical way, this lens is going to give you more repeatable, better ongoing results than what the Otus is. For the simple reason is that it's got very quick and accurate autofocus, it's got a great image stabilizer, and so as a result, as we saw in that final comparison, it may give you actually more real-world results than what the Otus would in equivalent situations. Now, if you put the Otus to its strengths, as I've done in some of these comparisons, it is magnificent, and I think that the images that come out of the Otus are incredibly special. But it's not a lens that I would be using every day either, for the reasons that I've just mentioned. And so, as they say, it's different horses for different courses. And I think that my advice to you as a potential consumer and as a photographer is you need to buy the lenses that actually suit your shooting style. Sometimes the lens that is the most highly reviewed or the sharpest isn't necessarily the best for you. And so just make your decisions based upon what suits your shooting needs the best. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find all the usual stuff. Image gallery for this and other lenses, linkage there. You can find purchase links there, and always thanks to those of you that make a point to purchase through my links to help support this channel. Those of you that become patrons, and if you'd like to become one of my patrons, there's linkage there to do that. And of course, as always, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. And thanks for watching. Have a great day.